Throughout history, humanity has never stopped fighting not only to defend its lands but to prove its intelligence, courage, and will to survive. Every battle carries untold stories, bold strategies, fatal mistakes, and moments that change the course of the world. Here on Military Tactics Channel, we revisit those pages of history to understand why sometimes a single decision can create a legend. Let's begin today's story. As the year 1944 drew to a close, the European continent witnessed a fateful shift in the balance of power. Following the decisive Allied victory in the Normandy landings in June and the destructive Soviet summer offensive on the Eastern Front, Nazi Germany stood on the precipice of total collapse. The swift liberation of occupied territories deprived the Reich of invaluable industrial, agricultural, and human resources that had sustained its war machine. In September 1944, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, the man chiefly responsible for wartime output, delivered a cold and undeniable estimate. Germany possessed enough resources to sustain the war effort for approximately one more year. This was more than a mere logistical problem. It was a death sentence for Hitler's expansionist ambitions. Amidst the internal turmoil, particularly after the failed assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, became increasingly isolated and resolute in clinging to power. He convinced himself that only a spectacular, surprising, and breakthrough military counteroffensive in the West could both restore the nation's flagging morale and reverse the military situation. Crucially, he believed this would compel Great Britain and the United States to sign a negotiated peace, thereby freeing the Wehrmacht's forces from the Western Front to confront the growing threat posed by the Soviet Union. The Western Allies, though gaining the upper hand, were nonetheless grappling with severe logistical challenges. The rapid advance through France and Belgium had severely strained their supply lines, destroyed bridges, cut railways, and the constant struggle to move fuel and ammunition to forward units became a persistent nightmare. This situation forced Allied leaders to temporarily slow their offensive operations, pausing to consolidate and resupply their resources. In the east, the Red Army had crossed into German territory in October 1944, but had been brought to a halt in Poland, where it was preparing for an imminent, massive winter offensive. Inside Germany, the Nazi regime pushed its total war program to the absolute limit. Every remaining source of labor was exploited, and extreme measures of human mobilization were enacted to assemble the last reserves for one final major blow. A historical paradox arose. Despite heavy Allied bombing, German industry managed to produce more tanks and artillery in 1944 than in any previous year. Yet, the quality of the manpower could not keep pace with the rate of equipment production. The newly formed units suffered from low morale, received minimal training, and were often inadequately equipped. Soldiers were assembled from diverse, inconsistent sources. Older ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, surplus naval personnel lacking ships who were converted to infantry combat, and other elements hastily improvised. The diary entries of veteran officers, such as instructor Günther Koschorek, expressed outrage at the rabble being sent for training. By late 1944, a standard U.S. division still maintained over 13,000 men, whereas a typical German division had dwindled to approximately 9,000 understrength and poorly equipped soldiers, often relying on captured Soviet artillery pieces and makeshift gear. Despite their low quality, these last resort reserves provided just enough of a breathing space for Hitler and the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW, to formalize their counteroffensive plan. In September 1944, Hitler first raised the idea of a counteroffensive in the West. While the majority of his generals advocated for a more limited operation, focused on the area around Aachen and Liège to stabilize the front, Hitler insisted on a big solution, große Lösung. A decisive strike through the Ardennes that would punch through the Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, seize the vital port city of Antwerp, and cut off all Allied forces in the Netherlands and Western Germany. He believed such a blow would shatter the Allied will and pave the way for a negotiated peace in the West. The Ardennes was chosen for two main reasons. First, the area was lightly defended by American troops. Second, it evoked the great German triumph of 1940, when German armor had burst through the same forests to defeat France. Hitler's plan focused on Phase 1, breaking through, crossing the Meuse, and striking north to capture Antwerp. Beyond that, however, the plans became alarmingly vague. Even senior German commanders like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later admitted after the war that merely reaching the Meuse would have been a near miracle, let alone driving all the way to Antwerp and holding it. The planning was rushed and tightly controlled by Hitler's obsession with secrecy. Chief of Operations Alfred Jodl had insufficient time to conduct a proper assessment of American military strength in the area, leading to a severe underestimation of the enemy's potential reaction. The logistical factor became a reckless gamble. Many German armored units carried enough fuel for only 30–40 kilometers of movement, yet Jodl's timetable envisioned spearheads covering nearly 200 kilometers to the Meuse in a single day. This meant they absolutely had to capture Allied fuel depots along the way to sustain the advance. Furthermore, the operation's success hinged on an uncontrollable factor: bad weather. Continuous overcast conditions were required to prevent the Allied air forces, which held overwhelming superiority, from taking to the skies. 3 German armies were mobilized for the operation, but they were uneven in strength and equipment. 6th SS Panzer Army, 6th SS Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich. This was the strongest force, comprising the remaining SS armored divisions, about 500 tanks, and over 1,000 artillery pieces. Its mission was to achieve the breakthrough, cross the Meuse, and seize Antwerp. 5th Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, under Hasso von Manteuffel. With approximately 400 tanks, this force operated in the center, advancing toward Brussels and establishing a defensive line there. 7th Army, 7th Army, under Erich Brandenberger. This force was the weakest, consisting primarily of unmotorized infantry with virtually no tanks. Its task was to push into Luxembourg and southern Belgium, establishing defenses against the anticipated counterattack by Patton's U.S. Third Army. The critical structural weakness lay in the southern flank. Assigning the understrength 7th Army the task of protecting the entire operation's flank rendered the entire plan vulnerable from the outset. German commanders were aware of this risk, but lacked the necessary reserves to mitigate it. In total, the Wehrmacht mobilized over 200,000 men in 29 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions, although internal assessments conceded that most of these divisions possessed low combat readiness. On the Allied side, the Ardennes sector was indeed lightly held. To support ongoing and planned offensives elsewhere, against the Ruhr River dams and Patton's thrust toward the Saar, General Omar Bradley had stretched the American lines thin, leaving the region guarded primarily by V Corps, Leonard Jarrow, and 8th Corps, Troy Middleton, with a total of about 80,000 troops. Notably, several units in the sector were cavalry groups mobile, flexible formations better suited for reconnaissance and pursuit than for holding a static defensive line in dense forest terrain. To ensure absolute secrecy, the German deployment in November and early December was executed primarily at night. Strict orders forbade fires and limited noise and movement during daylight hours. German reconnaissance planes even flew at low altitudes over the deployment area at night to check for lights and noise, using engine sounds to help mask the noise of vehicles below. Although Allied intelligence detected some signs of the German buildup, these warnings were often not transmitted in time or were severely discounted, leaving American forces completely surprised. However, Hitler's obsession with absolute secrecy created unnecessary logistical problems. To avoid aerial detection, much of the materiel and equipment had to be unloaded and stockpiled too far behind the front lines, complicating and slowing resupply efforts. When the offensive began, German forces possessed only about 15,000 tons of artillery ammunition, a quantity barely sufficient for roughly 10 days of fighting at the planned expenditure rate, against a daily requirement of 1,200 tons. Chronic shortages of trucks and fuel also proved detrimental. Gunner Emil Frey later recounted the bizarre sight. It often happened that one truck towed 3 launchers. Sometimes the VW Kübelwagen used by the unit commander was also hitched on behind. The whole train then looked more like a circus than a dangerous military unit. On the opposing side, many American troops in the Ardennes, which had been designated a quiet sector, were resting. Nevertheless, some observant GIs noticed increasingly frequent enemy reconnaissance patrols and the distant rumble of vehicle engines at night, suggesting that something is going on. In the early morning of December 16, following a heavy artillery barrage, German infantry began their assault, clearing paths for the armor. The terrifying screams of German troops charging in the darkness created an atmosphere of panic for the surprised American defenders. The results of the first day of fighting showed sharp differences across the front. Northern Wing, 6th SS Panzer Army. Despite being the strongest force with 4 panzer divisions, the Germans failed to achieve their first objective of securing Elsenborn Ridge. The thick forests and limited number of narrow roads created severe traffic jams. The premature commitment of reserves in an attempt to force a breakthrough only exacerbated the chaos. Central Wing, 5th Panzer Army. Manteuffel achieved greater success. The thin American defenses were pierced almost everywhere, opening the path for deeper penetration. Southern Wing, 7th Army. The spearheads managed to cross the Our and Sour rivers, but due to a lack of bridging equipment and accurate American artillery fire, the majority of the 7th Army remained stuck on the eastern banks of the rivers. This was an early indicator of the fragility of the southern flank. On December 17, the true scale of the attack became apparent, accompanied by the launch of 2 special operations. Operation Stuzer. This airborne operation faltered due to poor coordination and hasty preparation. Only about 300 paratroopers reached the target zone, and after days of hiding in the woods without relief, the survivors eventually slipped back through the lines. Operation Greif. Otto Skorzeni's infiltration unit, disguised in U.S. uniforms, was tasked with causing chaos. However, most teams were quickly identified and captured. Although German lawyers had assured Skorzeny that wearing enemy uniforms was legal if no weapons were used, in reality, the execution of infiltrators wearing friendly uniforms was common practice during the war. Concurrent with these tactical failures were horrifying war crimes. Kampfgruppe Piper, under the command of Joachim Piper, left a trail of massacres of American prisoners and Belgian civilians, culminating in the Malmedy massacre, where nearly 100 American POWs were brutally murdered. These atrocities only served to heighten the indignation and fighting resolve of the Allied forces. Facing the burgeoning crisis, Allied commanders held a crisis meeting on December 20. The most critical decision was to place all American forces north of the German penetration under the command of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Although this decision deeply frustrated U.S. 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley, the reorganization allowed for a more efficient and rapid deployment of reinforcements. Within a week, approximately 250,000 American troops, along with elements of the British XXX Corps, had reached the threatened sector. From December 23 onward, the tide began to turn. The element of German surprise had worn off, and logistical constraints lengthening supply lines, fuel shortages, and overburdened transport began to bite hard. The situation worsened dramatically for the Germans when the skies finally cleared on December 23. This event was the decisive turning point of the battle. Allied fighter bombers immediately flew in massive numbers, devastating German columns, supply routes, and logistical hubs. The overwhelming air superiority stripped the German forces of their mobility and tactical flexibility. Poorly equipped German infantry suffered grievous losses under sustained American artillery fire and airstrikes. Tanks increasingly found themselves attacking towns alone, lacking adequate infantry support, a role for which they were ill-suited. Christmas Eve marked the high-water mark of the German attack, but the German momentum had already begun to stall. The focal point of the campaign was the Belgian town of Bastogne, a crucial road junction where 7 major routes converged. On December 20, German forces encircled approximately 15,000 American troops there. American tactical flexibility was demonstrated when the U.S. Command immediately recognized Bastogne's strategic significance and rushed the 101st Airborne Division to reinforce the defense. The paratroopers arrived in Bastogne within 2 days. The determined American defense foiled the German attempt to seize the town in a quick coup de main. A fatal mistake by the Germans was the decision to split their forces. Instead of concentrating all available power to crush Bastogne, 2 panzer divisions continued their advance westward, leaving the 26th Volksgrenadier Division to continue the siege. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr Division later regretted. It was one of the greatest mistakes that Bastogne, upon failure of the coup, was not immediately captured by a concentrated attack of all our forces. Lacking sufficient artillery ammunition to destroy the defenders, the Germans issued an ultimatum demanding surrender on December 22. The acting U.S. commander of the defenders, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave the now famous singular response, "Nuts." Meanwhile, General George Patton executed a remarkable pivot with his Third Army, turning it north toward Bastogne on short notice. On December 23, 240 C-47 transport planes began dropping over 230 tons of supplies into the town. 4 days later, on December 27, Patton's tanks broke through the German lines, smashing the resistance of the weakening 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and establishing contact with the encircled American paratroopers. Fighting around Bastogne continued until January 16, when American forces advancing from the north and south linked up near Houffalize, effectively sealing the fate of the German Bulge. The Battle of Bastogne resulted in heavy casualties. 20,000 American soldiers, including 4,500 from the 101st Airborne alone, and 25,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded for a small town of immense strategic importance. With the strategic initiative back in Allied hands, counterattacks to regain lost positions were launched. The overwhelming Allied firepower was used to its full extent. Artillery and fighter bombers systematically bombed German-held villages to the ground. German morale began to crumble under the relentless pounding. In January 1945, a war crime also occurred at Chinon, where some American soldiers were reported to have executed German prisoners. On January 1, the Luftwaffe attempted one last major blow, Operation Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate. Nearly 1,000 fighter aircraft took off simultaneously to strike Allied airfields in Western Europe. Although they achieved initial surprise and destroyed approximately 260 Allied aircraft on the ground, the German losses were irreparable. Over 300 German aircraft were lost. The Allies could quickly replace their losses, while the Luftwaffe no longer had the capacity to recover. The Allies slowly but steadily pushed back the German salient throughout the first weeks of January. On January 10, the German High Command began pulling 3 elite panzer divisions out of the front line to send them to Hungary. The situation worsened further when the Red Army launched a massive winter offensive from the Vistula River on January 12, forcing Germany to divert all available reserves eastward. The remaining German units in the Ardennes were gradually reduced to rearguard roles, covering withdrawals. On the 28th of January 1945, the U.S. Army officially declared the Battle of the Bulge over. The Ardennes campaign inflicted massive losses. United States, approximately 86,000 casualties, 8,600 killed, 21,000 missing, captured 47,000 wounded, plus 20,000 non-battle casualties, such as frostbite. Germany, approximately 85,000 casualties, 15,500 killed, 27,500 missing, captured 42,000 wounded. Civilians. Over 3,000 Belgian and Luxembourg civilians were killed, many by retreating German forces or in Allied air raids on German-held villages. The Battle of the Bulge ended in a clear and total defeat for Nazi Germany. Historical analysts generally agree that the operation was doomed from the start due to deep structural weaknesses, critical logistical deficiencies. The chronic shortage of fuel, ammunition, and motorization was insurmountable. The plan's dependence on capturing Allied depots was a reckless and impractical gamble. Prioritization of secrecy over preparation. Hitler's obsession with secrecy led to rushed planning, lack of reconnaissance, and a misjudgment of enemy strength. Many units attacked blind, without clear knowledge of the terrain or enemy positions. Political force allocation. The decision to concentrate the best Waffen-SS units in the northern sector, where Allied resistance was expected to be strongest, rather than using them to exploit the enemy's weak points, ran contrary to fundamental military logic. This decision was largely driven by Hitler's political trust in the SS after the July 20 plot, not sound strategy. Dependence on weather. The reliance on bad weather was an irremediable strategic flaw. Once the skies cleared, the overwhelming Allied air superiority severed German supply lines and destroyed their mobility, thereby guaranteeing failure. Low force quality. By late 1944, the German army was no longer an effective war machine. It was composed of last-minute levies, poorly trained, ill-equipped, and lacking the logistical backbone and reserves necessary to sustain a prolonged offensive against an enemy with inexhaustible industrial and human resources. The Ardennes offensive was a desperate gamble that failed spectacularly. It squandered Germany's last strategic reserves, and far from altering the outcome in the West, it merely prolonged the conflict for a few costly months, and ultimately helped accelerate the Red Army's approach to Berlin, thereby hastening the collapse of the Third Reich. Following this decisive victory, the Western Allies regrouped and turned toward their next objective, the German industrial heartland and the Rhine River, initiating the Rhineland Campaign, the last major set-piece battle on the Western Front of World War II. Every story in history teaches us valuable lessons about strategy, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Thanks for exploring today's story with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to discover more fascinating historical stories with us. See you in the next episode, where strategy and intelligence continue to shape history.